I want to talk about a little anime that we started, which you've probably already heard of, but I'll at least share my initial impressions of it. Dungeon Meshi, aka Delicious in Dungeon. So so Dungeon Meshi. Here's a fun little tidbit. So meshi means food in Japanese. It also means rice. They have a different word for food, gohan. Gohan also means rice. Because in Japan, rice is just synonymous with the word food. So that's a funny little quirk of the language. There's like 2 or 3 helicopters going over my head today. I think they found me. So Dungeon Meshi is it was manga that has been getting pretty popular, and it's getting an anime adaptation. I don't know if the season is complete yet. I don't think it is. But we watched the first 4 or 5 episodes of it because Kat, she loves the elf character, the elf girl, and Marcel, something like that. So we put it on. It's on Netflix. And yeah, I really like that show. So essentially, Dungeon Meshi is... It's funny because it's one of those concepts that I look at, I hear, I vaguely knew what it was about. But once it was actually, I sat down to watch the show, I was like, why have I never seen this before? Why haven't I seen anything else that did this idea? Maybe not as hardcore, but even just some of the ideas. It feels so, it's one of those great concepts that feels, it doesn't just feel fresh, it feels obvious. Like, oh, of course. Why doesn't this existed? The premise of Dungeon Meshi is that it is a fantasy show about a little group of adventurers who, the main character's sister has been captured by a dragon at the bottom of a dungeon. And they were fighting this dragon. She cast this spell because they were all gonna die, and she cast this spell to send them back up to the surface. So they're going to plunge back into the depths of the dungeon, but on the way, they realize that one of their real problems, one of the biggest hurdles that they're facing, isn't necessarily the difficulty or the challenge of the dungeon. It's that they aren't eating properly. They aren't eating enough food, and they're just hungry. You know, they're hungry and they're not on their A game because of it. So usually what you'd find, you know, it's taking a little bit off of that idea of that you'll see in RPGs, where there'll be, you know, you got to go into town to buy food and then go take that food into the dungeon, and that'll like fuel you through. The big difference is that they make this connection, and this is where the kind of freshness of the idea comes in for me. They make the connection. Well, specifically the main character, he's like, wait a second. Why don't we just eat the monsters that we're killing? Like, we're killing all of these monsters. They're all edible, or most of them should be edible. Like, they're just like animals and stuff like that, or plants. Shouldn't we be able, and obviously because all of these monsters exist down in this dungeon, on these multiple floors of this dungeon, clearly there's some kind of ecosystem where something will eat something else, and they're able to eat each other. So why don't we just do that? And so they meet this dwarf named Senshi, who's like a cooking expert, and he's been living in the dungeon for years. And he kind of becomes their sort of cooking guide, as they all kind of venture through this dungeon and use the various skills to overcome little challenges every episode, and it always, you know, it builds up to them finding a new thing to eat. And it's one of those, again, it's this idea that feels so obvious, where it's like the loop, but because of the existing, I guess, trope, or what I'm already familiar with from other media, it just never occurred to me, right? Because it's always been like, you go into like old RPGs, and you go play Ultima, and it's like, you go into town to buy food, and then you, with your gold, Then you go into the dungeon to fight monsters. The monsters give you gold, and then the gold finances the food that you get and the armor and equipment upgrades that you buy the next time you're in town. And for some reason, it's just never occurred to anyone that, like, wait, what if there wasn't a point where you had to, like, circle back? What if you could use the monsters to hunt and eat? I'm pretty sure Monster Hunter probably does something like this, but I've never played Monster Hunter, so shut up. And I really like watching this show. I really want to, like, play a game that uses this as a central, like, system. Wouldn't that, like, I think that would be a really neat way to add a level of interactivity to the monsters that you're killing. That, like, they can be used, you can harvest their materials, the things from killing them, and use it to, like, craft more items, or, you know, make potions out of them to cure stuff, or just food, right? And food might have different effects and do different stuff for you. That stuff is like that's a really cool system, and I can't really, if it exists, I'd love to hear about it. If there's a game that is like that, I'd love for you, let me know. But this is the first anime that I've seen do anything with that concept, and even in just like 4 or 5 episodes in, it's done quite a bit. Like, I was surprised at how much of the show is about, like, based off of kind of the rules of, like, ecology and understanding the ecosystem. So, like, there's so many neat, cool little ideas. Like, I guess this is kind of spoilers, but there's an episode where this is not far at all into the show, so, you know, I don't think this is going to be big spoilers, but there's an episode where they there's all these, like, suits of armor. The living armor is what they call them. And what is his name? Laios? He's, like, the main knight guy. And he's the one who's obsessed with, like, cooking everything and finding out what everything tastes like. And they reach this point where they're in the dungeon where there's a bunch of living armors, and they're guarding something, and they don't know quite what, and they're having trouble getting through this area. They have to retreat, and Laios is like, I wonder what they taste like. And they're like, it's metal, you can't eat metal, they're armor, they're animated by, like, magic or something. And he's like, oh, okay. So they go through the episode, and Laios has this one-on-one encounter where he just notices that there's, like, the armor, the way that it behaves is weird to him. He's like, oh, he knocks off its head. And then he notices that it picks it back up and straightens it, and it kind of, like, it feels like it looks at him. And he's like, that's weird if they're being animated by magic or something, and if they don't need the head to see, why is it going to find the helmet, right? Why does it move a certain way? And he's putting all these little observations and clues together until finally he, like, knocks off the helmet again, and he takes his sword and he, like, jams it through one of the plates. So there's, like, 2 layers. He realizes that there's 2 layers to the armor, and he, like, cracks it open. He wedges it open, and he discovers that there's actually a colony of, like, mollusks living between the armor plates. And all of these mollusks, like shellfish, the way that shellfish will find some kind of shelter, you know, a shell, and hole up inside of it. All of these mollusks have gotten into these pieces of armor and connected together to form a colony and act, like, by just expanding and contracting, act like muscles. And that's how the suits of armor move, which is such a cool idea. It's not magic at all. It's actually, like, there's this animal inside of it. And naturally that means, of course, they can eat them. So they make, like, they essentially, like, it's literally like peeling mussels, you know, like peeling shellfish. And they make, like, a whole meal out of this one suit of armor. And it's just, like, this really cool idea. There's this whole thing about the dwarf, and he grows on one of the levels of the dungeon. There's, like, golems. The golems are obviously made of dirt, and the he basically uses the golems as gardens. So he like plants. So what he does is they have like this core inside of them where they're kind of activated by this magical sort of totem inside. So he like beats them up. He knocks the totem out of them, and then when they're down, he essentially like plants vegetables in them and makes sure that he's rotating his crops so that the soil stays healthy. And then he, at the end of that, he reburies the totem inside so that they'll reform after a while. And essentially, the golems will naturally protect themselves and each other, which means that the vegetables are going to stay protected. And a character even asks, like, "Oh, are the vegetables kind of like parasites because they're digging the roots into them?" And he's like, "Well, no, actually, because the roots spread throughout the soil, it actually makes it firmer, which makes the golems stronger, and so it's actually like a symbiotic relationship, like how there's certain birds that will rest on certain animals and like pick the fleas off of them for food and stuff like that. It's that kind of a relationship, and just like that's such a cool idea, and I can't believe I've never heard of anything that used a fantasy creature concept like that. Like, oh my, it was so cool using a golem as a vegetable garden. It's so cool. And the golems, there's a bit about how the golems naturally keep out the stronger monsters from the lower floors. So if all the golems were to disappear, the ecosystem of the whole dungeon would get thrown off, because there would be nothing stopping the big monsters from going up to the higher floors. Excuse me. And it's great. It's really fun. There's the main character is just like this he's like this friendly, just very curious knight guy who's just really into the idea of cooking everything. Senshi is this little dwarf dude who is like an expert at cooking. And he's always very just kind of stone cold. Like, he does not care. He's great. Marcel is an elf wizard, and she's the picky eater. She's a little bit like, she's a little too good for a couple things, but she's cute. And she's usually the one who has to kind of like, she has to try something new to find out that she likes it, and then she's cool. And then what is his name? Chucklefuck? It's like Tuck Chuck or something like that. He's the thief, and he checks traps for them. There's a great episode where there's this whole room that's full of hidden traps that trigger when you step on certain stones in the floor, and they start using the traps as basically like makeshift like cooking stations. So like the big guillotine that drops from the ceiling and would slice them in half, they drop like the body of like this giant bat that they killed. They put the body on there, and then they have the thief guy step on the specific stone to trigger the trap, and it drops down, and it like that's how they like slice up the body. Or like this flame trap that was supposed to just like incinerate them. They use it to like they fill a pan with oil from the trap, and then have it like they put some ingredients in the pan, and then they have him step on the trap so that they can shoot fire all over it, and then like deep fry the ingredients and make a whole meal out of it. And it's like just cool. Like, oh man, this is so neat. It's such a creative, cool show. It's like, it's one of those things where there's so many manga that are extremely specific. I've heard that manga is like an anime or like fetishistic genres. Not fetishistic in like a sexual way necessarily, although they can be. But in the sense that it takes this one thing, like one topic, and it hyper focuses on it, and it just goes all in, and like, this manga exists because the writer likes this thing. He likes, Hanafuda. This guy is really into, like, reading Dr. Stone was like, okay, Riichiro Inagaki is just mad into science. He just loves all kinds of science, and he's super into it. Just like, this guy likes this thing, and he's gonna write a story to make you like it too, motherfucker. How many like fitness based manga are there about like, yeah, we're gonna like lure you in with like the cute girls working out and getting all sweaty, but actually there's gonna be like a 2-page explanation of how to exercise safely and like how to exercise properly with like safe movements and stuff like that, and how what parts of the muscles that they work out. And it's like, that's how they get you. And this feels like a story from a guy who is really into fantasy stuff. And I guess like there's like a whole group of topics related to like hunting animals, like hunting and harvesting, plants and animals, and how you make those, and then using all the parts of them to make food. I don't know what you'd call the group of that. Hunting and gathering, I suppose. Really into that idea, and he really likes fantasy. And some part of him was like, what if you combine those? Almost like there's a frustration. I can, like, for 10 years, he's been like, why hasn't anyone written a story about fantasy? Haven't I ever seen a fantasy story where they actually killed a monster and then they eat it? Why haven't I seen that as the focus of a show or something? And he just wrote it. He just wrote that story. And his years and years of little scribblings of ideas, like, golems could be like a vegetable garden, and you can use traps to help you cook your food and prepare it, and all this stuff that he's just tossing into his story, with some very charming, fun characters. And I don't know, it just, every single episode we watched, and again, we didn't even watch half the season, but every single episode we watched, we finished it, and I was like, that was a good episode. That was a cool episode. Every single one. I really can't recommend it enough. And from what I've heard, the manga the anime is only covering a certain portion of the manga so far, and it is consistently good. Everyone that I've heard talk about it says, yep, Dungeon Meshi, delicious in dungeon, in English, is consistently good. So I would definitely give that one a watch if that sounds interesting at all. If you like just kind of like fun, creative stories, like taking something that you're probably familiar with and going at it from a perspective you never would have thought of before.